Albert Rookie. I'm postdoc here at SESYNC for Global Ecology.
Hi, Carrie Ritz. I'm the Associate Director for Research here.
Hi, Dean Ari, SESYNC postdoc in the geography.
Julie Silva, I'm a sabbatical fellow this year. Sorry. Ginger Allington,
I'm Heather Randall, postdoc and I'm assistant.
I'm Jim Boyd, the Director of Social Science and Policy and economist at Research.
I'm Mary Shelley. I'm the Associate Director for Synthesis. I lead our data science. I'm Elizabeth Green. I'm an assistant on the data science.
Ian?
Hi, I'm Ian. I support research here as a data scientist.
I'm Maya. I'm a postdoc here and I'm a geographer.
I'm Nate. I'm a hydrologist.
I'm Chris, postdoc, coastal ecology.
Colin, postdoc, disease ecologist.
Billy Hall, postdoc in geography.
Cindy William, the Associate Director of Education. Abby York. I'm Associate Professor at Arizona State University.
Hi, I'm Benoit, so I'm the data science team.
I'm Margaret Palmer, Director. Welcome.
Thanks. We're doing the non-linearities really well. Excellent. You know Bianca?
Hi.
Now we'll go back over here.
Hi, I'm Christine.
It's okay. I'm Christine. I'm a research support assistant.
I'm Elizabeth Diller. I'm a master's student of Margaret Palmer.
I'm Anna Kotkamp. I'm also a master's student in carbon storage and soils.
I'm Philip Sanichenko. I study food webs.
Dexter Locke, postdoctoral fellow in urban greening.
I'm Chris Trisas, postdoc working on urban biodiversity and climate change.
Robert Rankin, I study population biology of dolphins.
Morgan Grove, I'm a visiting social scholar and I always mess this up. I'm a visiting social science scholar here at SESYNC and I also work for the U.S. Forest Service. And so I'd like to introduce Tom Koontz. Dr. Koontz had started out as an undergrad at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He went on to get his master's and PhD at Indiana University, where he worked in the policy sciences and environment. He also worked there in Lynn Ostrom's shop and really helped to pioneer the work with institutions and understanding how institutions interact, respond to, and also affect the way that people manage land or fisheries and how it responds to the environment. If I may read some, his interdisciplinary graduate studies focused on environmental policy as it relates to human systems, including institutions, stakeholder participation, and community-based natural resource management, as well as natural systems such as forest, watershed, and the global climate. As a research assistant with the IFRI, International Forest Resources and Institutions Program, which is what I mentioned in terms of Lynn Ostrom, he collaborated with international scholars examining the ecological and socio-political aspects of community-based natural resource management and coupled human and natural systems. In addition to his work on institutions, I'm going to conclude, his work on institutions, he's also done a phenomenal amount of work on collaborative management, and those will be some of the things that I'll be talking about today. Great. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Morgan, and thanks everyone for coming. This is a great turnout here. It's lovely to be here on the East Coast and escape the Seattle rain just for a few days anyway. That's what October means in the Northwest. Today I'm going to be talking about two very recent projects I've been working on in that part of the country as a window to understand more about the science policy nexus, how local watershed partnerships might use science, which we all hope that they will use science, and the degree to which and what they use it for is a thing that we're trying to understand. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering today. A brief introduction and a bit of literature, but not too heavy on literature, on what we know about how scientists might interact with policymakers and specifically collaborative watershed teams. I'll give you a couple of overarching research questions and a little info on the study context, the lovely Puget Sound in the state of Washington, and an agency called the Puget Sound Partnership. Then I'm going to talk about 2 studies that I've done, one each year basically, since I've arrived in 2014 at my location in the University of Washington. So the first one is about looking at documents that these collaborative groups are creating, and looking at the meetings that they're going to, and then also the plans that they create. And I'll give you some specific research questions, methods, results, discussion. Then I'll jump to study 2, which is the second round, which was a survey of members of these partnerships. I'll give you some more specific research questions, methods, results, and then discussion, and then I'll wrap up. So fairly standard stuff. Let me jump in with an introduction to kind of motivate these studies. I may not need to say this to the people in the room, but I'll say it anyway. Addressing many environmental challenges can benefit from the use of science. We can think about science as giving us insights into cause and effect relationships between environmental pressures and outcomes. This is one thing we can use science for. This would be the natural scientist's chance to shine here. I have an example here of thinking about water quality, which is what I think about a lot. We have an example of harmful algal blooms, which is in some parts of the U.S. are a pretty big deal, and what farmer practices help lead or not lead to harmful algal blooms. We know that phosphorus runoff, for example, does. So we can do natural science studies about those processes. Probably depends on soil type and slope and time of application and lots of chemical interactions. We can also back up a step and say, why is it the farmers are doing the practices that they're doing? So maybe economic incentive programs have an impact on what the farmers choose to do. We can have social scientists help us understand the human behavior that leads to the practices, which then lead to the ecological outcomes. And for this study, I'm going to talk about science informing public policies. If we want to know which type or location or timing of runoff has the most impact, which is the part down here, and we want to understand how to design interventions to change farmer behavior, which is over here, all of those ideas might be used when we're developing plans for how we're going to move forward and address water quality. So the boxes here I've shown in red is going to be the focus today. How do different collaborative processes lead to the plans that we see? And we hope that maybe those plans will address proper incentives for the proper practices. So this would be an ideal scenario. Of course, there are challenges to having science in this part of the process. So a couple of more obvious ones. Policymakers don't always access science or understand it or even find it relevant for their work or use it in their decisions. Science is under attack politically. We hear this phrase all the time, more so in the last year, but it's a continuing thread throughout a lot of the history of politics in this country. Recently, though, we can look at headlines for cutting funding for science, for NSF, for certain specific parts of the NSF. I'm a political scientist, and every couple of years there's a letter from my association goes around saying, Congressman, we don't think you should single out political science because it is important, and there's a few others that get picked on a lot. But in general, we can cite science funding going down. Also, political decisions can override scientific evidence. Who hasn't heard a story about a government agency doing some environmental decision where the scientist recommended something and then it got whited out or changed? Like that happens quite a bit with political decisions. And then those of you who remember way back in March, a lot has happened since then. There was the March for Science, I think it was in April, where scientists and those supporters of science felt like they needed to come out and march in the streets and say, don't forget about science. So this is a big deal, right? Getting science to be something that's inserted into the decision makings that we make for policy. In addition, another challenge that I'm suggesting for science is that more and more we see this idea of collaborative governance as a way to address complex public issues. That means we're no longer having government agencies decide on most things, but we're having multiple stakeholders coming together. In my study context, it's for water. These are sometimes scientists and sometimes managers and sometimes publics, various public stakeholders, landowners, all of those folks coming together. So you think it was tough to get science informing things when you just had the agencies. Now add in all these other folks. It could make it very difficult for the science to actually be used and incorporated. So we have a little bit of background on what we already know from social science studies of types of the use of science. So I don't know if you've seen this framework before, but it's thinking about what science is used, or maybe better yet, how science is used. And there's three ways we can think of this. One is instrumental. So instrumental use of science is the direct application of scientific knowledge to solve a particular problem or to understand a specific cause and effect relationship. This is, I think, how a lot of scientists work. We're looking for an answer to a research question, so we access science to inform directly on that question. This is one way that science could be used in policy making, and this is seen as a good way to use science. Science helps us understand and make better decisions. So I'll normatively say this is a good use of science. Another way to use science is a little bit less directly. It's called conceptual knowledge, to more generally understand a phenomena so that decisions can be informed, maybe not directly using a piece of science to inform something, but understanding the field that it's in. Like me coming to this workshop and listening to lots of different scholars, I'm not going to maybe directly apply that, but it'll seep in and it'll help inform the way that I see the world and see things I'm working on. So this is conceptual use. This is also seen as a, quote, good use of science, normatively. Then we have symbolic. This is the bad use of science that scholars have talked about. This is where you have a predetermined action that you want to take, and you go and look for science that'll support what you want to do already. So you're not using science at the front end, you're using it at the back end to legitimate something. So this tends to be sort of frowned upon. Like, if we're going to use science, maybe instrumental and conceptual is a little bit better than symbolic. And there was a nice study that was done in 2004 up in Canada, a large-scale survey of members of lots of different government agencies in Canada. And that study asked lots of questions about use of science among government agencies in the government state, and I think it was provincial and national level Canadian bureaucracies. And one of the things that Amara et al. Asked was conceptual use versus symbolic versus instrument. So this is asking bureaucrats, tell me, when you encounter science, how likely are you to use it for these kinds of things? And they rated on a scale of 1 to 5. So there's a bit of pre-studies about this different types of use of science. And I'm going to return to this later when I tell you the results of what I found and look at these three types of uses as well, and I'll compare it to this Canadian study. We also know some things about how science is used in government agencies. And most of this research is on the barriers, why it's so hard for science to be used in agencies. And one sort of common thesis is the two communities thesis. That is to say, the agency managers are in a very distinct and different community than scientists. And this distinct community is marked by differences in goals and norms and incentives and information needs. The people in agencies, their main goals are to solve problems sooner rather than later with incomplete information. They want more quick information, not detailed 30-page scientific studies. And their incentives are to do well now, and maybe in the long term it won't work out, but they really want to get things done today. The scientists have very different goals. Scientists typically care more about doing good research that gets cited in highly reviewed journals, and that takes more time to unfold. They may be gathering lots of information before they make a lot of claims, and their incentives are not about solving a problem today necessarily, as much as trying to build to the stack of knowledge we have. So these two communities are incommensurate in many ways, so we shouldn't expect them to seamlessly merge together over the use of science. We do have a number of studies that have examined the factors that affect the use of science. Typically, they're trying to understand why is science used so little, or what helps it to be used a bit more. So there's a couple of sets of variables here. One is the relational aspects between these two communities. How do they relate to each other? How does the scientist relate to the government agency official? And so some things that help are, first of all, face-to-face communications. Do they interact with each other and meet each other face-to-face and have a relationship in that way? And are these relationships two-way? Is it just the scientist speaking, like I'm speaking to you and everyone listening, or is it two-way, like in the last 15 minutes of this talk when we're going to have a bit more interaction? Another way of thinking about another variable here is the research product itself. This is typically a journal article, a paper, or a report. So it's been suggested that certain characteristics of the research product can help an agency use science more. And there's several things here. How easy is it to understand? How about credibility and verifiability? Is it trusted by the government official? Applicability, this is a big one I've been seeing in some interviews out in Puget Sound. This protocol for measuring salmon health was developed in the East Coast. Does it apply to my site? If it doesn't, I'm not going to really use it. The timing of the information, when the bureaucrat is making a decision, can they get access to science that they need today? Or when they go to the scientist, does the scientist say, I'll have a study done in 3 years, I'll let you know. So the timing is important. And then finally, the focus on the variables that a manager can actually do something about. If a key variable is socioeconomic status of a community, the bureaucrat's not going to be able to do anything about that. But if the key variable is type of educational campaign, well, there's some actionable kind of science. So is it variables that the manager can do something about? The third major set of factor is individual attributes of the government agency official. And just a couple here that stand out in a few studies. Higher educated folks are thought to be more likely to make use of science. And then if that individual is a scientist versus a non-scientist. Of course, government agency officials are sometimes scientists themselves. Often they're not, but they might be. So these are all things that are thought to affect use of science in government agencies. Now I'm going to switch to a much more lightly studied area, which is the use of science in these collaborative partnerships. First, I'll say that several studies have found that science is a key factor for success in some cases. In some cases, we know that collaborative watershed partnerships have made good use of science to make better decisions and been successful. In other cases, it's not necessarily that. So we have some sort of mixed bag here. We have a few factors that might affect the use of science in these collaborations. Some of these will start to look familiar from the government agencies, but they're not identical. Relational, trust and network building is important, and also face-to-face communication. And then two-way communication is important. And then here's one that's sort of not mentioned in the government agency research, but mixing scientists and non-scientists. If you're going to have a watershed partnership, instead of having the science technical group over here and the citizens group over here, that creates barriers. Having them sit together at the table and work together, at least in a couple of cases, seems to be very useful. Okay. One more thing I'll mention, the management stage of the watershed partnership. If a watershed partnership is sitting down to identify where are the problems in our watershed, getting that on the table, there's one study that was done about 10 years ago that suggests science can be very important in helping identify the problems. Unfortunately, once it gets to solving them, in that case, it wasn't all that influential. So it might have something to do with the management stage. So with that said, I want to move on to the overarching research questions for today. Put them up here. So the first one is, how much and how is science deliberated in these collaborative partnership meetings? So in the meetings, you usually have 10 to 20 people, maybe a little bit less, coming together every quarter, every month, and talking about what the group is working on, and often they're working on a plan. The second question, how much and what kind of science is included in these plans that they create? We got a hold of these plans and look through them to analyze how much was science cited, for example. And then the third one is, how is science used and communicated by collaborative partnership members as they're developing the plans? And this is not limited to what is said at the meetings, but it's whatever they're doing. We had a survey to get at this question and asked them, when you're working on the plan, tell us all these things about how you use science. So these are the questions I'm going to talk about with two separate studies. The first study looks at the first two questions. First of all, though, let me tell you about the study context. If you notice, anybody here been to the Puget Sound region? Some folks have been out to Seattle, right? Beautiful location, my home region. I grew up there. I didn't appreciate it until I moved to Ohio for 15 years, and I'm like, that Puget Sound was awesome. Let me get back there. So the study context is, first of all, the name is confusing, so let me clear this up. This is a state agency that's called the Puget Sound Partnership. Usually the word partnership means it's not a state agency, it's a partnership. So the generic term partnership is what I use and what scholars use. They name themselves the Puget Sound Partnership. This is a state agency, okay? So that's the first thing you need to know. Next thing to know is Puget Sound Partnership, the state agency, is very science driven. This is cool if you think science should play a role because they have science work plans, they have strategic science plan, they have a science panel, they have a social science panel, which I've never heard of before. There's natural and social scientists involved. They get millions of dollars every year from federal and state sources to do cleanup work in the Puget Sound, but they don't do the work themselves as much as they organize and coordinate, and they work on the science end. So this is a highly resourced organization. The partnership then encourages local groups called local integrating organizations, LIOs. They're local groups centered around smaller scale watersheds in the basin to use science in drafting plans that are relevant for their local scale and their local realities, but in tune with the needs of the whole Puget Sound and in tune with science. So on paper, this is a fantastic setup. The LIOs were established and funded by the Puget Sound Partnership to base, this is their guidelines. They gave them money. They said, you can have this grant, and here's what you have to do for us. Make a plan, base work on the best scientific information available, including information from tribal, local, state, federal, and Puget Sound Partnership scientific staff and the science panel. So pretty direct here. You must use science. There's guidance documents that are given that suggest going for cause-effect explanations. They call these things results chains. I think of them as logic models. They're diagrams. This causes this, causes this, causes this. And so they call them results chains. And they have to use the mechanisms supporting or dissenting studies, provenance, and expertise underlying predicted impacts should all be presented, explained, discussed, and even questioned and defended in the context of the deliberations of these groups. So this would be a tall order even for a graduate research lab, let alone these community-based groups, but this is what they're getting money and this is what they're instructed to do. So this is like a best case scenario. If science is going to be used, well, we probably would see it in this particular set of cases. The partnership held workshops and established plan formats and even gave feedback on the drafts of the plan, and then they were told to revise them and resubmit them. So a lot of science going on here. The first study, how much and how is science used in the planning process is, how much and how is science used in the end product, which is their plan, and then how do these compare to watershed organizations in the same region not funded by the partnership? So a little compare and contrast going on. We have several cases of LIOs funded by the state agency, and we found a couple of watershed organizations, not many, but a couple that had a plan and had meeting minutes on the web as well. So we had a little comparison as well. So to do that, it was a qualitative comparative case study of LIO and non-LIO collaborative efforts. We're looking at the planning process. We analyzed meeting minutes from the LIO and non-LIO executive bodies and also technical committees. So executive bodies met usually every quarter or every month or so. Technical advisory committees didn't meet as often, but that's where you would expect maybe the science is really happening and maybe they would transmit that to the executive bodies. So we had executive body minutes from 36 meetings from 8 LIOs, and we found these 3 non-LIOs that published meeting minutes, so we had 26 of those as well. Then we had a few technical committees, 3 from these LIOs, 3 LIOs rather for 12 meetings, and then we just found 1 non-LIO that bothered to publish meetings on the web. So we had 6 of those. So we're going to analyze this, and I'll show you the results in a minute. The plans, we look at these things are called ecosystem recovery plans. This is a watershed management plan. Typically, it describes the region and then the main threats to the water quality and then ideas for how to fix it. So a standard kind of a management plan called ecosystem recovery plan. And we're going to analyze how science is mentioned, if at all, in these plans. And here we had 9 LIOs had their plans published, and then we found 2 non-LIOs with a plan, so we can compare. And this is a very simple analysis. We're looking at just the number and type of references that were cited throughout the body of these things. These were typically on the order of 60 to 80 or 90 pages long. So in there, we're wondering how much scientific research is being cited. Okay, so let me go to that first research question. executive meetings. We found several themes in how science is being discussed in these meetings. Note, these are not transcripts, so we didn't do any deep deliberative analysis, but the meeting minutes reported on all the things the groups talked about. So 4 types of ways we saw science coming up in these executive meetings. The first one is consulting with scientists as a basis for recommendation. They'll talk about somebody consulting a scientist before they did a decision on something. The second one is reporting that others are compiling factors that are affecting environmental outcomes. So this was the second one that talked about salmon prioritization, talked about Biostream Environmental as a contractor that will synthesize what we know about keeping salmonid stocks at current performance. Science, sort of techie kind of jargon. The third theme is discussing results of scientific research. So this would be one guy was discussing marine mammal surveys and saying a little bit about the water they contain cocaine, nicotine, and more. This is a big study in the Puget Sound that there's nicotine from all the Starbucks consumption is in Puget Sound because, of course, caffeine goes through your body and ends up in the waterway. So discussing some results of scientific research. And then finally, compiling research on restoration efforts. Talking about somebody at the meeting said, this person met with folks from this organization to brainstorm ways to compile research about the Delta restoration efforts. So this isn't really deep dives on discussing methods, right? This is just kind of saying, this person's doing this person's doing this. Did you know the study is out? So this was some, but certainly I wouldn't call it deliberations deep in science. These are from the executive meetings. And we quantified this by counting. We coded these meeting minutes to see how many of the blocks of text that were different subjects ended up being about science versus being about other things. And if you look down at the bottom here, our total and the LIOs, 277 text blocks across all these meeting minutes, and 6.9% of them had something to do with science. That is one of those themes there. The non-LIO meetings, we had 154 text blocks and merely 3 of them. So quite a bit less, 1.9% of the text blocks had to do with science. So is science being discussed in these meetings? Yeah, kind of maybe once in a while. They were talking a lot about budgets and other stuff. Not super surprising, but it was nice to see sort of quantified. That was the executive committee. What about the technical committees? That's where you would think maybe a lot of that would be happening. And here it was happening. I don't have a good count of the text blocks. It still wasn't the majority of text blocks, but it was a lot deeper dive. So some themes, these themes were different. They were discussing cause and effect relationships, kind of like we saw here, but also results chains, how the priority pressures for the region didn't match local experts' views, discussing how results chains from the agency didn't include international pressures from Canada, and they had conceptual models they were sharing about Chinook salmon. One of these groups, the LIO8, had an entire 3-hour meeting devoted to reviewing and ranking all these different actions, including monitoring and scientific data, and that was all about science. So there were fewer of these meetings, but we noticed in the meeting minutes evidence of a lot of deep discussions about science. Okay. Finally, in this study, we looked at these ecosystem recovery plans, combed through the text to see how many scientific articles and things were being cited. This is the page length, so one was 87, that was the high one. I guess there were a few down in the 40s, and there's one that was pretty skimpy. These top groups, LIO 7, 9, 6, and so forth, these are the LIOs. Down at the bottom 2 rows are the non-LIOs, just for comparison. So if you look across this column here, the peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, they're not citing me or you or anyone. They're not citing scientific journals. One of them cited a conference paper, which we kind of counted as sort of, kind of, maybe. And then LIO8 actually had one. It stuck out like a sore thumb. This is one instance where they cited a journal article. So they weren't citing journal articles. The non-LIOs, one of them actually had 8 citations, which seems pretty high, but if you've ever graded student papers, like I require my students to cite 10 articles when they're doing a 4-page paper. So, I don't think this is a lot, but it's not 0. And the other non-LIO had 0. So clearly they're not referring to science journals. These actually didn't have in-text citations, Remember I said the state agency gave them directions on the plans? They gave them pretty specific directions. They said, put all your sources of scientific evidence in a table in the back. So all of them had table 1, sources of our evidence, but it wasn't scientific journal articles. It was mostly what we would call gray literature, just to be mean, because I'm a scientist and gray is not something we think of as an awesome color, but a lot of computers are gray, so maybe we should rethink that. The gray literature, they were citing reports from government agencies, but a lot of documents that the Puget Sound Partnership had itself compiled, and maybe the Puget Sound Partnership looked to scientific studies. So I actually went and looked at these sources. There's 4 or 5 of them that come up a lot. And most of these sources from the Puget Sound Partnership themselves don't cite scientific journal articles. It's, again, citing more gray literature. So yes, it's science. It's not peer-reviewed science from journals, but it's science. And that's what we found in these recovery plans. So to kind of wrap up this first part of the study 1, answering the research questions, how much and how is science used in local planning processes funded by this agency? The answer is, well, executive body meetings, it's really not used. Mostly reporting that others are using science rather than any deliberations about science. In technical committee meetings, science is used more often and more deeply. Participants discussed the merits of particular cause and effect. Are actually debated, right? And they actually talked about, well, I think your data doesn't apply because it was from the drought year, and your data is from Canada. So, they were discussing this. They also, a few of them talked about citizen science, which made me kind of excited because citizen science is part of all of this stuff. How to effectively use it, discussing whether trusting the bird counts or the salmon counts that citizens did. High schoolers were doing projects with stream water quality. How much can we rely on their data? And these are questions that people are asking about citizen science, and they were showing up in these groups. Ground truthing science explanations with their local conditions. This seems to have applied when they removed the dam in the Elwha, but over here the dam is a low head, so what's the ramifications of that? And this warmed my heart. They actually talked about social science once in a while, like behavioral chains of cause and effect, like I was showing at the beginning of this talk. Okay, we have this instrument we have this farmer practice affects water quality. How is it that we get the behavior to change? So some of that would come up. And also organizing local science seminars to engage with citizens in scientific discussions, like popular science forums they would have, and people would come and engage in science. So all of that was happening in these technical committees. Second research question, how much and how is science included in the products of this work, the ecosystem recovery plans? And the answer is plans have virtually no direct references to peer-reviewed scientific studies. However, they indicate sources of causal explanations as coming largely from the state agency and other regional and gray literature, some of which might refer to peer-reviewed scientific studies, some might not. So directly no, but it's science-y, and maybe we call it science. I think I probably would, but not the kind of science that we might think about as peer-reviewed science. And research question 3, how does the use of science in these local organizations from the state agency compare with use of science in local organizations in the same region, but not hooked up with the agency funding and guidelines? And executive body meetings, these other groups exhibit even less use of science in their executive meetings. And the technical committee meetings, these groups use science similar to the LAO technical committees. Although it must be noted that we only had meeting minutes from one of these meetings. This non-LAO is funded from a different top-down science-based organization, the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. So I have a feeling that might be why we see so much. We want to get our hands on some meeting minutes from organizations that don't have a strong affiliation with the government program. There are a few around. There's not many. The scene is crowded with lots of collaborative watershed groups in the region that have some ties to federal or state or local money. So those are a very different kind of beast than the kitchen table, 5 neighbors getting together to chat about things. But at least we have something suggesting it's not just that the PSP is driving the science being used, but this other organization also had science being discussed there. And the recovery plans was mixed. One of the non-LIO groups included no direct references to peer-reviewed studies, while the other one did have some and had 8 references. So what do we take away from this? I presented this at the Puget Sound Partnership Agency, my first draft, and it was sort of negative, and they're like, but you didn't capture all this other stuff that's happening. So the phase 2 did that, which I'll share in a minute. But then I stepped back, and after having done phase 1 and phase 2, I conclude that when a top-down collaborative effort really seeks to encourage the use of science at the local level, actually it can happen. It did happen in these technical meetings. Plans don't reflect peer-reviewed science directly, but they are incorporating science. So yeah, I say that it can happen. We have evidence from technical committee meetings especially that suggests the use of science to make causal claims. So that's good news if you want science to be incorporated. But deliberation of science is not likely in these executive meetings. So this is maybe the bigger point is, yes, it's good for the technical committees with those specialists, but does it translate into things that are deliberated among the more general non-scientists? And the answer seems to be no, it doesn't. So it's in the plan, but those meetings were not involving much discussion about science. Also, a second point, just kind of beware. I've done other research on top-down versus bottom-up collaborative efforts. Top-down guidance can be a double-edged sword. It may foster the use of science, but in other studies, it's been shown that having a strong government top-down hand in these collaborative efforts can have some negative effects as well. Can reduce the possibility of creative, innovative approaches because the government has certain ways of doing things typically, and local folks, their voices may not be heard. Also, if you're interested in the degree to which collaboration increases social learning among people who are stakeholders. I did a study previously that suggested if you have top-down government kind of guiding and controlling the products, then that reduces opportunities for social learning. So those are some possible downsides to having the government swoop in with a bunch of guidance and resources. And finally, in creating these plans, LIOs do not draw directly on peer-reviewed scientific journals, but they do rely heavily on several of the agency documents. So this leads to a question, what are the benefits and drawbacks of relying on the gray literature? Maybe it's just my own science hat, my bias that I think peer-reviewed science should be used a lot, but maybe that's not appropriate. Maybe folks who are on the front lines with management choices, maybe for them it makes a lot more sense to spend time with the gray literature that's already been kind of passed through a filter and maybe made a bit more actionable. So I'm kind of agnostic on whether I think this is normatively a good or bad thing, but it's something to point out that they're not really directly citing, as scientists would cite, their sources of evidence, but they are using this other kind of science. Okay, so shift gears a little bit. Second research set of questions. This is where we actually did phone surveys of people involved in these groups and asked questions that we couldn't answer just from looking at what happened at the meetings and what in the plans. So 1, to what degree is scientific research used instrumentally, conceptually, and symbolically? Remember those 3 types I mentioned at the beginning? So we asked them to what degree did they use science in these 3 ways. Secondly, how influential is science compared to other things in creating plans, right? It's not supposed to be a science plan. It's supposed to involve stakeholders because it's supposed to be informed by local realities, not purely science. And in any policy realm, I can tell you science is not alone in what drives decisions. Sometimes it's really important, sometimes it's ignored, but it's never like the sole thing that people do when we're talking about public policy. So we wanted to compare science versus other factors in shaping what went into those plans. Third, what are some factors that might affect how much science is used? Relational, research product, individual factors affecting the use of science in drafting these plans. And then finally, what are the most important channels through which scientific information is obtained? This is a big focus of work we're doing now with focus groups, but we're wanting to know, like, how do you get your scientific information, right? Are you going to meetings, or you call people up, or you read journals? I don't think you read journals. Do you read journals? So we're asking people about these things. These are the 4 questions motivating the survey that we did. It's a telephone survey. Participants in 7 of these LIOs who were involved in creating the ecosystem recovery plans. Questions about the use of science. It was about a 10 to 20 minute telephone survey. We had a universe of 101 identified participants from these 7 groups. These were a mix of scientists and non-scientists. So a couple of examples: County Health Department, City Zoning Board, tribal leaders, environmental nonprofits. It wasn't John Q. Public Citizen showing up. These groups, all of these folks were some representative function, but it was pretty diverse who was in these groups. So we identified 101 people to contact. So we're going to do a telephone survey with these folks Any guesses on how many we would reach? All of them?
20.
33! Yay! Took us 3 months to do. I worked with undergraduate students in a class about doing research, and I said, have I got a research project for you? So I designed this survey, and I assigned them each a number of people, and then they got busy, and some were more successful than others. But in the end, we were able to drag out 33 survey responses. The most common response was we couldn't get a hold of them. After 7 tries on our phone log, I told them we didn't have to bug them anymore, because that was probably going to be an unreachable person. But only 2 people said no. So either they just ignored us as a way of saying no, or they're super busy. But we got 33 back. So I have some results from those 33 surveys. So first one is the type of use of science. Remember, conceptual is about scientific research using indirectly to inform thinking. That was the most commonly highly rated use of science. On this scale here, note that 1 is strongly agree and 5 is strongly disagree. So lower numbers mean there's more agreement. So 1.8, that's pretty close to that. Strongly agree that scientific research was used indirectly to inform our thinking. The second highest rated one was instrumental. Scientific research was directly incorporated into the text of the plan. We directly used it for specific things. That was a 2.4. And then the symbolic use, scientific research was used after the fact to justify choices already made in the recovery plan. That was quite a bit lower. So either they're lying to us, but I don't think so. We let them know it is anonymous, confidential. This was in a list of a lot of other questions. So I do think this is reasonable estimation of the order in which they think they're using science. And the conceptual one clearly is the one that we had the strongest agreement on. Second question here was about what things shaped the plan contents. Like, was it all science or partly science or no science? And so we had a long list of things that they told us from 1 to 3, not influential to very influential, and 2 would sort of be in the middle, somewhat influential. So here, the higher numbers are more influential. So I just rank them based on the scores. What stakeholders want was the most influential, but right up there with local, time, and place specific information, and right up there with scientific or technical information provided, but not by the partnership, from other places. So this is interesting because the plan was citing things they got from the partnership. So they're reporting getting scientific information from other scientific sources other than just the agency. And that was up there with a 2.5. So the top 3 in there's not a lot of fall off between 2.6, 2.5, 2.4. But the point is, up at the top there, yes, science is up, but yes, other stuff is up there too. One of my favorites ended up being pretty low down here. Political feasibility, what's acceptable? I would expect that that's pretty important, because if you put it in a plan and you know it's not going to fly, you're not going to put it in the plan. But it was the least of the things that we listed. So that was just having them report on how influential stuff was. Okay, related to that is factors shaping the use of science. We asked them about things related to the research product as well as the relational. And these are specific questions. We asked how influential was this in whether or not you used it in the planning process? Was it applicable to the objectives? And that was the highest rated one with the 2.6. The credibility of the source was important, and then it sort of drops off a bit. Was it variables for which intervention is possible? These were all research product features from literature that I told you about earlier, where you have things might affect the usability of the scientific research. And then there was one relational piece. Was it recommended by another member of the group? And that sort of was fairly high, and then it falls off to other things. So there were a few of the research product variables that seemed to matter in terms of use of science. So note, the first one is what shapes the plan content? Was it science? Was it other stuff? The second table I just showed you was about, okay, when you're using science, what affects the use of science? And its research product seems to be rising to the top of the list. In addition, we did some correlations with the use of science. So we asked them the degree to which they had two-way interactions with scientists, the degree to which that affected we asked them the degree to which they had two-way interaction with scientists, and then later we asked them about, do you use it to indirectly inform your thinking? So we then just used standard correlation on that to see which variables are correlated, and the yellow ones are just highlighted as the is the relational ones, and then the individual is down below. So I want to talk about the relational ones first. So whether or not they had two-way interactions with scientists is statistically significantly correlated in a positive direction with, that's the little star there, with them later in the survey saying that I use it conceptually. The two-way interaction was also correlated with the instrumental use of science. So the more they interact with scientists, the more they used it specifically, directly to help put it in the text. And then the symbolic use didn't seem to be correlated with use with two-way interactions. Then the relationship part about whether or not they have relationships with scientists. I established relationships with scientists. There's a correlation between whether they establish relationships and whether they actually used science conceptually. That wasn't quite significant on the second one here. It was close. This was a two-tailed test, so it was a conservative test. If I had made it a one-tailed test, it would have been significant. But the trend is certainly in that direction. And then this one, there was a relationship inverse with the symbolic use. People who established relationship with scientists were less likely to say they used it to justify a pre-made decision. So that was interesting. The other ones below didn't seem to have strong correlations with whether or not they were scientists. Didn't seem to matter in terms of their in terms of their use of symbolic, conceptual, or instrumental. Nor did the education level seem to be significant correlation there. Okay, and the last question here is sort of a practical question. How do you get your science? What channels of communication? And the top scoring ones, talking directly with scientists in meetings or by phone or email, was up at the top. 3 again is more important, so 2.4 is close to the very important end. Reading scientific or technical reports, again from sources outside the partnership, was similarly important. And then attending organized conferences and workshops with scientists. All of these are actually up there, right? They're all at least 2.0. Reading guidance documents from the partnership, and then talking directly with non-scientists also. So a lot of different things seem to be important, including this direct interaction as well as reading reports. Some of the literature suggests that that government agencies really don't read reports much. So this is showing kind of high than what you would expect in a government agency. But again, the partnership was funding them and sort of making them follow these guidelines, so I presume that's why we see the reading PSP documents at least showing up. And then they're getting other reports from other places. So what does that mean for these 4 questions? Just to summarize, to what degree is scientific research used instrumentally, conceptually, and symbolically? In collaborative planning, conceptual is the winner. That's the most frequently cited as the highest, and then followed by instrumental, and then symbolic. Remember, the first 2 I said are sort of the good uses of science, and the symbolic one is maybe not so good. In this case, it kind of fell out. The good uses of science reported to be used more. Second, how influential is scientific information compared to other factors in shaping the plans? And it's similarly influential as things like local information and stakeholder wants were rolled up there. It wasn't the top of the heap, but it also wasn't way down at the bottom. It was up there with these other things. The third one is looking at variables that might affect use of science and relational, research product, and individual. The relational, the two-way interactions with scientists and having relationships with science seem to help and promote use of science. The research product, several of these items, whether it was applicable, whether it was credible, and whether it was interventionable, right, something about which I have some control over, those also were correlated. And the individual variable wasn't correlated with education level or whether they identified as a scientist. And then finally, what are the most important channels? Talking directly with scientists, as well as reading scientific reports, and conferences were sort of the top most important ones they mentioned there. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, I compared it to the Amara et al. From 2004 study on the Canadian agencies. And in that study, the most frequently cited use of science was conceptual first, then symbolic, then instrumental was last. In the Puget Sound case, we had a reversal of orders 2 and 3. Instrumental beat out symbolic. So maybe the scientific emphasis from all the resources and guidance, maybe that paid off. And it worked, and so there was more use of instrumental science than we might have predicted. Or maybe the fact that I asked about planning is different than work generally. The study of the Canadian bureaucrats wasn't about a specific planning process, it was about in their work. So maybe different parts of the work have different levels of use of science. Or maybe collaboration encourages more instrumental use than when government agencies are asked to use science. These are all possibilities. Second point, collaborative governance. Those of you who know anything about collaborative governance, a big argument is that the good thing about collaborative governance is that it can blend large-scale scientific knowledge with contextualized, locally relevant planning and strategies. And the study results support this hope. We have results of what shaped the plan. It was a mixture of science as well as local things. Next point is that relational variables, this interaction with scientists and building relationships, correlate positively with the use of science, especially the conceptual use of science. So this supports prior studies about government agencies. Now it seems to apply also to people who are working in these collaborative partnerships of many different folks. And then supports prior studies on the importance of the product, the research product itself. Is it applicable? Is it credible? Is it interventionable? Also, I would say that it's clear that the partnership is not perceived to be the most important provider of science, but the partnership, the PSP approach, did lead to the use of science. So the partnership set this in motion, they resourced it, they gave guidelines, and then the local groups used other science as well. So this would be categorized in a book that I wrote, some colleagues, about how governments interact with these collaborative groups. This is the government as a facilitator rather than a driver of the product process. Even though they were top down and they gave them a lot of direction, they weren't the only source of science that was used. These local groups did go out and get other information. Also, there's no single best channel for communicating science. Both two-way communication, like talking with people, as well as one-way reading documents, both were relatively important. So there's been a lot of discussion literature about it's worthless to just have a document and hand it off and expect anyone to do anything with it. Here they're reporting that they are reading reports and doing things with it. So it's not as dire as saying that no one's ever going to read our stuff. Maybe it wasn't scientific journal articles, but there was one-way and two-way communication. And of course, some limitations. This is a small end study, 33 respondents. It was only the planning stage, right? It wasn't at other phases of what's going to happen in implementation. And this is what I call a best case scenario of effort and resources to promote the use of science. Not all collaborative partnerships are in a system that has this much emphasis and resources given to use science. Okay, let me just wrap up both of these studies in the broader context here. So back up a step. Earlier, remember I said that both science and collaboration are increasingly called for to address these complex socio-ecological system challenges. There's a lot of rhetoric about we need to use science, and we get upset when we feel like it's become politicized and not being used by the policymakers. So there's more call that we should be using science to solve these problems. In addition, there's more call for using collaborative strategies to deal with non-point source pollution and all these things that one government directive can't solve. So both of these things are happening together. Science is not easily used by government agencies. There's a lot of barriers, we know. But what about collaborative partnerships? And so this study was tackling that. In a science-driven, well-resourced collaborative process, which was the Puget Sound Partnership, science is scarcely deliberated in these general meetings, executive meetings, but it's more deeply deliberated in technical meetings. Ecosystem recovery plans reference gray literature rather than peer-reviewed journal articles. Partnership members report using science conceptually as the most, and then instrumentally, and lastly was the symbolic use. In shaping plans, science is similarly influential as local information and as what stakeholders want. Science is in there in the mix. It's not the dominant one, but it's also not way down the list. Relational factors and product characteristics affect how much science is used, those relations with scientists, as well as the applicability of the report. And key communication channels are both two-way communication and one-way. Writing reports, they are reading those reports. Okay. Next steps. So this is our phase 3 of the project. We're doing group interviews with partnership members to ask about how they search for and access science. A lot of people use Google Scholar. I was happy that they know about it. A lot of them complained about not having access to online journals because it's a subscription and universities have it and local health departments don't. But one lady swore that she knew a workaround through some Russian site that could access any journal article. I'm like, okay, well, we'll leave it at that. So how are they accessing these things, right? And also questions about how are they evaluating the quality. Remember, the quality is something that's important in use of science. How do they evaluate? Are they looking at research methods? Are they looking at peer review? And it's a real mixture of what people think what scientific quality looks like. But there's mostly agreement that peer-reviewed journal articles are the group we've been talking to, the groups we've talked to. Peer-reviewed journal articles is seen as like high quality. Although someone said they didn't trust peer-reviewed journal articles, but they trust government. So it depends. Also want to see how group members incorporate it into their work, including any barriers and ideas for overcoming barriers. So we've talked to 5 groups already. Some of them are LIOs and some of them are these other non-LI groups. So I'm curious to see how that compares. Future work, some ideas for continuing on this. I've been just talking about science, but actually, how about natural science versus social science? I would suspect that natural science is the coin of the realm and social science is really off in the corner. We didn't really have an instrument that talked about that, so we don't have a good way to know that, although we're getting at it a little bit in the work that we're doing currently. And then specifically for SESYNC, how do partnerships work across disciplines? Again, we're treating science as one thing, do you science or not, but how do the scientists interact across disciplines? This is really uncharted territory in government agencies, let alone in collaborative management efforts. And it would be interesting to expand to cases with less of a science focus, right? Not this place where it's heavily science-oriented and resource, but places with less of a science focus, and other locations, and in particular, some citizen-based groups that aren't full of government agency people, but actually people who are neighbors and they get together and try to do stream cleanups and that sort of thing. So, acknowledgements. This is how I gave my students opportunities to learn. Undergraduates, I'm at a teaching-based university these days, so I don't have any graduate students, which is very sad for me. But I do have opportunities to work with undergraduates on research, and these are 2 classes that I led that had them do stuff. So in the questions, if you want, I can talk more about how to do work with undergrads and even grad students. Most of my work over the years has been with students doing a lot of the work. So I value that and appreciate that, and I've found things that work better than others in my new setting as well. But I'll leave you with this question slide and a picture of the beautiful Pacific Northwest. This is where I live, so I'm lucky to go to work every day and live here. So thank you. Riku. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is super interesting. Thank you, first of all, for that talk. And the last 25 years of conservation in the U.S. very much has moved towards this collaborative model. Not in the PSP quasi-collaborative sense, but and part of that is also the marketization of ecosystem services, payments for ecosystem services schemes, and so on. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that dimension in the context of the Puget Sound, not the PSP specifically, but so that's kind of the broad question I have.
Yeah. So let me start by I started all this in Ohio, and it's been great to compare the settings. I've also done research in Germany, which is another comparative case. In Ohio, the impetus for this was really the federal government was starting to crack down on non-point source pollution, and they said that if you don't meet this water quality standard, we're going to force local governments to develop total maximum daily loads. And nobody wanted that. So they're looking for workarounds, right? Another case where the government with the big stick is super helpful to motivate something over in another arena. So in Ohio, the motivation was largely to avoid the heavy regulation, but also certain groups, friends of the Olentangy watershed, friends of the such and such river, genuine citizen interest in cleaning up their waterways. So it was very much a bottom-up kind of a grassroots effort. So this is the world of a lot of grassroots citizen initiated things. Even there, though, government agencies were involved because citizen groups would bring them in. So we did a study many years ago just categorizing these groups as mostly citizen-based versus mostly from government, like the Puget Sound Partnership, and then this sort of hybrid. And they do different things and achieve different things. So that was Ohio. In Washington, I was very surprised to see the dominance of these government groups. And what I've come to learn is that because of the salmon being endangered and because of the tribes having there was something called the Bolt decision in 1972 that went back to the old treaty rights, and the Native American tribes said, look, when we ceded this land to the U.S., we were guaranteed the rights to hunt and fish in our customary hunting and fishing grounds, and it had been ignored like all other treaties for years. But in 1972, a federal court ruled that yes, this was enforced. So all of a sudden, the tribes became a huge, powerful stakeholder in managing the resource, specifically salmon. And they started getting a lot of resources, and they had rights, and they became partners with the state agencies, Fish and Wildlife Agency. In most states, the Fish and Wildlife Agency is in charge of everything related to fishing and hunting. Here, you had the tribes negotiating with them, so now they're a powerful player at the table. And salmon has been driving a lot of things related to water quality, in particular, efforts to protect the water quality and restore it. So we've got several federal laws. There's something that created marine resource committees. It was a federal law. There's a couple of state planning laws, all empowered people and gave lots of money to do things to figure out how to save the salmon. So I say, every day I say, thank goodness for those salmon. That ripple effect has been that we have water quality that's being cleaned up. And the impetus is largely coming from these higher level decisions about laws that were being made that then incentivized people, but more importantly, poured in lots and lots of resources. The tribes actually hire lots of scientists. So in a lot of the things I read, you have local indigenous knowledge here and science over here, and how do they meet? In the Puget Sound, the tribes have the scientific knowledge as well. So it's a very interesting case, a very unusual case, but I would say it's very dominated by the layers of institutions from government programs and laws that have empowered local groups to some degree and given lots of resources towards these efforts and moving planning forward. So it is very different from Ohio, which was just here and there watershed groups doing stuff. This is a region that's been in the news for many decades and has had a lot of resources and interest in it.
Sorry though, but could you connect that to PES? Mine's a more political economic question. It's not about the resources to support the tribal groups.
Yeah.
I'm asking more about, are there specific sorts of incentive programs like wetlands mitigation?
Yeah.
Tradable?
The action I've seen lately is not on those things. It's more on local zoning and convincing local zoning boards to use low impact development. That was the most recent thing. There's a big war on what they call shoreline armoring. And one of the problems with the salmon not being able to thrive is that the areas where the eelgrass grow on the shore, property owners don't want erosion, so they put bulkheads up, and that is bad. So now they're trying to figure out how to get landowners to either remove them, which is tough to get them to remove them because that's your property, or encouraging local zoning boards to make rules that say you're not allowed to put in these things. So that's been some of the action. I haven't heard really much of anything about payment for ecological services as a way to do this. The big threat is incoming. We have millions more people moving to Seattle in the next 10 years because of Amazon and Microsoft and all of that. And so I think that's why the zoning is the big deal these days, because they know with more development it can get worse. So that's probably why the zoning is a key point they're trying to deal with. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things that we talked about earlier in her introduction to her research was this trade-off in research between generality and specificity or local information. And so I feel like you mentioned in your phone surveys people talking about both caring about like local information, but also caring about sort of the credibility of the research. And so I was just wondering if you are interested in, or if you like have more information on how people think when they're using scientific research about having like local studies that they feel like really apply to where they're working versus having something that actually has like a scientific consensus.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we didn't capture that in our survey, but we're asking that very question in our group interviews, and that's coming through loud and clear. One of the qualities to know if the study is good quality is they say, well, this is the protocol they use to measure the abundance of oysters in this place, but does it apply here? This part of our island has a special circumstance. So local applicability is rising up as something we're hearing quite a lot that matters a lot. And there's also scientists at the table, and those are the ones who say, well, I look at methods, and everyone looks at him like, what are you talking about? So it's not everyone, but there are folks who also look at the scientific methods. But what we're hearing probably a bit more so far is that they want to know if it's applicable to their circumstance. And they appreciate that others have done monitoring and protocols and found cause and effect, but if they're skeptical on whether that would actually apply to their circumstance because of whatever contextual difference, then they're less likely to rely on it and more likely to look around and say, who else in this area has done any kind of study? They don't care if it's peer-reviewed at that point. They just want to know who else, what other bay have they been trying to reseed with oysters, and what do we know about that? So local context seems to be pretty important in their use of science, as well as in whether they put belief and trust in it. Yeah. Yeah.
I find, after your talk, wanting to know a lot more about the gray literature that they were using.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any way of getting at that. I mean, I'm actually a fan of gray literature. I can see it being not only sound, but arguably better in a lot of ways. It may be written more clearly. It may be actually, more applicable. It may have more institutional context that these audiences are finding useful. It's readable rather than incomprehensible. And now, of course, it might be junk science too, but I would love for you to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, so I can tell you the most frequently listed sources of information in the table 1, where they said, this is where evidence comes from. So a lot of things from the agency itself. One was called the Action Agenda, Puget Sound Partnership, where they put their heads together with the science board and figured out what are the actions we need to take to help the whole estuary as a whole. And that actually, I see by my notes, did have scientific references. They also had an adaptive Chinook monitoring and adaptive management plan. Chinook is a kind of salmon, and that was a set of plans that local areas had developed. And I don't know what's in those plans, but it was local land use plans. And then the third item was Puget Sound pressure assessment. And this is, I had trouble categorizing this. So they did a phone survey where they asked experts to say, what do you think are the biggest threats to our region? And they specifically looked for scientists, but it wasn't all scientists. So I'm a scientist. I get a call. They ask me to give my opinion. Is that science? It's not really, but it's assessing. So I am a conduit to science, right? Because I've read it. And a lot of this is they talk to a person and they don't go to a study, but they talk to a person. And that person is aware of these studies, and that person tells them, here's some advice. And by the way, maybe you look at this study. But mostly they're talking to the person. So it's not just gray literature. It's a human being is a gray literature, right? It's like a conduit. So that was one of these, an expert expert survey study. And then the LIO's 2014 near terms action document. So each one of these things previously did a different report about what it wants to do in the near term. So these are, I don't know how you categorize these, but yeah, this is what the gray literature is that they're mostly using. And I'm with you. Maybe gray literature is just what they ought to be using. I mean, I don't know, but it's different than the peer-reviewed science, right? But as you said, and as our groups are mentioning, they often find it more user-friendly and readable and to the point if they can find it. If one of the folks we interviewed has this dream that there's going to be somewhere, we said, what would be a way to reduce barriers to using science? Somewhere create a database that we could key in keywords and it'd give us the best reports to answer a research question. I'm like, don't we kind of do that? But we don't. But yeah, I don't think you can do that. But that's what they're looking for, a way to, this massive information they know is out there. And sometimes a person is the best Google, right? The person. Yeah.
I have kind of like question/comment. First of all, I'm wondering, does the Puget Sound Partnership ever consider making like summary documents like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate?
Yeah. It has a big dashboard, State of the Puget Sound. Every 2 years it comes out. They spend a lot of time on developing this wheel of targets for 2020 and how we're doing. And the folks who did it are like performance management guys. Like they did a good job. They did a really good job on saying, here's what we want. Now here are ways to measure it, and here's an indicator. And they publish all of that.
Well, that's sort of like, I'm thinking more like a summary document. Like this is the state of the literature. This is what we know with citations, and providing that kind of a document to the groups so they could access the literature in a more concise and understandable way.
Yeah.
As opposed to something that directly tells them what they ought to do, but more just like not telling them what they ought to do, but providing them access to a summary of the information. And then my other question was, I mean, Mental A, the citation software allows you to make groups where you can put all the articles you want and then join people to them, and then they can access all the articles in a searchable way. I'm wondering if something like that could be a potential workaround to provide people with access to articles.
Yeah, I don't think giving them a better computer database is going to help anything. I think we have a lot of databases out there. I think it's talking to the person. That's why the relational stuff kind of came up. I think I don't have time to spend a week delving in the literature and going off in these rabbit holes, but I'm going to call up Colin because I know he's an expert in epidemiology. I'm going to say, here's a question I have, Colin. What do you think about that? And then Colin might say, well, let me think about that, and okay, here's what I think. Or maybe Colin knows 3 things that would apply. So having that extra step of filter, I think, is useful for these folks because they're in a management setting and they're not academics and they don't have time to do all of these things. So yeah, and your first question about what they were publishing, I don't know exactly what they're feeding to them, but they gave them instruction on these results chains. They had workshops on, everybody, this is what a results chain is. You got to think about the root cause and so I mean, it was from a performance management perspective, it's really cool stuff. So I think the places I've been studying these efforts, Puget Sound is by far and away the leader in the amount of attention and care and analytical rigor given to the whole process of and they have the social science in there. So there's a lot going on, but I don't know how much of that ends up being manageable in chunks to give to people on the ground writing out the plans.
I think that we are at our end in terms of for this, and I'd like to thank you very much and watch your waits.
Thank you.